The words entered the room softly, but they did not land softly. "I'm pregnant." They crashed into Kang Do-han with enough force to silence everything else. Every composed thought, every carefully constructed wall, every calculated response that had carried him through 15 years of dangerous living. The apartment went utterly, completely still. The city outside still breathed and moved in the way Seoul always did, indifferent and enormous. Cars sliding through wet streets below, a distant siren dissolving into rain, the low vibration of 10 million lives pressing against the windows. But inside that small apartment, time folded inward around 3 words and refused to open back up. Ella watched him carefully. She had studied Kang Do-han since the night they met. Kang Do-han simply stood by the window with a glass of whiskey he barely touched and watched the city below with the kind of patience that made her wonder what he was waiting for. She had found out later what he was. She had stayed anyway, and now she stood in the center of his careful, controlled world, holding the most chaotic 3 words she had ever spoken. And for the first time since meeting Kang Do-han, she saw him completely unprepared. No controlled response, no calculated composure, no immediate solution rising behind his dark eyes like a strategy forming in real time. Just shock, real shock, the kind a person cannot manufacture or manage, that arrives before the mind has a chance to intercept it. His gaze stayed fixed on her face, like he was trying to confirm she was real. Like if he looked away for even a second, the moment might rearrange itself into something more manageable. Ella wrapped her arms around herself tightly. She had practiced this conversation 17 times in the bathroom mirror this morning. She had rehearsed the calm version, the matter-of-fact version, the slightly humorous version, designed to deflate the weight before it crushed them both. She had prepared for every reaction except the one she was getting, which was no reaction at all. Just him, standing there, being completely, honestly human for the first time she had ever witnessed. She hated how vulnerable it made her feel, how much she suddenly needed something from him that she refused to name. "I found out this morning," she said quietly. "So before you start thinking I kept it from you." Do-han moved. Fast. Not away from her. Toward her. Ella stopped talking immediately when his hands found her arms. Warm hands. Steady hands. The kind of hands that had done things she didn't ask about, and he didn't volunteer. But in this moment, they felt like the safest thing she had ever known. Grounding. Like he was anchoring her to the floor before she floated apart completely. "You're pregnant," he said again. Not a question. Something softer than that. Like the reality of it was still trying to settle inside him, and he needed to hear it twice to make room for it. Ella let out a weak laugh, despite everything. That's usually how it works, yes. Normally, he would have told anyone else not to joke in a moment like this. But this was Ella, and even now, standing in the wreckage of a moment that could destroy everything, she was trying to make him feel less overwhelmed, trying to make herself feel less terrified by wrapping the whole thing in something lighter. That alone nearly ruined him. His gaze dropped briefly to her stomach. Not dramatically, not possessively, just quietly, carefully, the way a man looks at something he didn't know he wanted until it was already real. Like there was suddenly something sacred standing in front of him, and he hadn't been warned to prepare. Ella noticed, and God help her. Tears burned her eyes immediately, sudden, violent, humiliating tears that she had absolutely no interest in releasing in front of him. "No," she whispered quickly, looking away. "Please don't do that." His brows pulled together slightly. "Do what?" "Look at me like—" her voice cracked softly despite every effort she made to prevent it. "Like I matter too much." The room fell quiet again. A different kind of quiet than before. Not the shock quiet of 3 words landing. This was the quiet of something settling, something deciding. Do-han stared at her for a long moment. Long enough that the silence itself became a kind of answer. "You do." Simple, honest, devastating. The word went into her chest like a key into a lock she had spent years pretending didn't exist. Ella laughed once through the emotion. The wet, hopeless laugh of someone losing a battle they were trying very hard to win, and wiped her face angrily with the back of her hand. "You really need to stop saying things like that." "Why?" "Because I believe you when you say them." That hit him harder than she realized. Because Ella didn't believe people easily. Ella had spent years watching the world with careful, clever eyes and keeping her heart behind something thick enough to muffle the noise. And somehow, without fully intending to, he had gotten through. He stepped closer slowly. Ella didn't move away. The space between them had always been charged. It had been charged every time since. Every conversation that went longer than either of them planned. Every silence that stretched and neither of them filled because the silence was somehow saying everything. Every moment where they stood close enough to feel the heat of the other person and pretended not to notice. They had kissed exactly twice before tonight. Both times had felt like surviving something. "I'm scared," she admitted finally. There it was. The truth. Not the brave version she showed the world. Not the sharp-tongued Ella who fought everybody with wit and pride and a mouth she had weaponized long ago against anything that might hurt her. Just a girl, far from home, in a city she had adopted out of stubbornness and ambition, carrying a child she had never once planned for, standing in the apartment of a man who belonged to a world that should have terrified her more than it did. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. Something changed in Do-han's face then. Not power, not coldness, something softer, human. The expression of a man who had spent his entire adult life being the most dangerous person in every room he entered, discovering that he had absolutely no defense against this particular girl in this particular moment. His thumb brushed gently against her arm. "You're not alone." Ella closed her eyes immediately, because hearing those words in his voice, low and certain and without performance, almost broke her apart completely. Not because they were extraordinary words, because they weren't, because he said them the way a man says something he has simply decided to be true. "You shouldn't promise things you can't keep," she whispered emotionally. "I keep my promises." She looked up at him then. There was something terrifying about the sincerity in his eyes, because Kang Do-han was not speaking like a man trying to comfort a frightened woman. He was speaking like a man who had already made a decision and was simply informing her of it. "I mean it," he said quietly. "You will never carry this alone." Ella's breathing shook slightly. The air between them thickened without warning. That invisible shift, that atmospheric change that had nothing to do with temperature. She was aware of every point of contact between his hands and her skin, aware of the steadiness of his breathing compared to the unsteadiness of hers, aware that if she leaned forward even slightly, she would be against him, that if he lowered his head even slightly, there would be no more distance between them at all. She stepped slightly sideways before she could let either of them make a choice they hadn't finished thinking through. "Your fiancé would love hearing this speech." His expression darkened immediately, the warmth shuddering into something harder. "She has nothing to do with this." "She has everything to do with this." Ella snapped emotionally. "Do-han, she literally exists." Silence, tense and heavy, and full of things neither of them had said yet. Then quietly, carefully, like placing something fragile onto a table and taking his hand back slowly. "I don't love her." Ella froze. The confession entered the room slowly, dangerously, like smoke. Do-han held her gaze steadily and did not look away. "I never have." Her chest tightened painfully. She became aware of her heartbeat in a way that felt uncomfortable, like her body was listening too closely to something her mind hadn't caught up with yet. "Don't say things like that," she whispered. "It's the truth." "No." She shook her head quickly. "No, because if you say things like that, then this becomes real." "It is real." The way he said it made her breath catch. No hesitation in it, no confusion, just the flat, certain weight of a man who already knew what he wanted and had perhaps known for longer than either of them had been ready to admit. And somehow, God help her, that was worse. Not because she didn't want it, because she did. because she wanted it in a way that scared her far more than the pregnancy did, far more than Soyeon's diamond ring and political family and carefully constructed future did. Because Ella had survived everything by keeping at least 1 foot outside every door, and Kang Do-han was standing in the middle of the room asking her to come all the way inside. She turned away from him immediately, trying to breathe properly, trying to find the version of herself that was still sensible. "You're making this harder." "I know. You're supposed to be making this easier." "I'm trying." She laughed weakly despite herself. "You're terrible at it." For the first time, actually genuinely for the first time, Kang Do-han smiled. Small, brief, beautiful, like watching a light come on in a building you assumed had been abandoned. Ella stared at him in complete shock. "Oh my God," she breathed. "You can smile." His smile disappeared almost immediately. "Don't make it strange." "It already is strange." She pointed at him emotionally. "You smiling feels illegal." Something warm entered his eyes then. Dangerously warm. The kind of warmth that made her want to step toward him instead of back. That made her forget all the very good, very reasonable arguments she had been building in her head since this morning. She felt his gaze before she felt him move. And suddenly she was very aware of how close he was standing again. The air between them had been charged before. It was electric now. Pulled taut. Every careful, sensible thing she had told herself about this man and this situation dissolving in the heat of the space between them, in the way his dark eyes moved over her face like he was reading something he had been trying to understand for months. His fingers slid slowly down her arms until his hands found hers. Ella's heartbeat betrayed her instantly. She felt it in her throat, in her wrists, in every place that made lying about composure impossible. "You should stop looking at me like that," she murmured softly. "Like what?" "Like you forgot we're in the middle of a crisis." "You're carrying my child," he said quietly. "Nothing about you feels like a crisis to me." The breath left her lungs completely. Emotion rose so fast into her chest it almost hurt. Not the sharp, grief-adjacent emotion from before, but something warmer and more terrifying. Something that wanted, "Do-han." His hand lifted slowly to her face. Careful, like touching something precious that might pull away. His thumb traced the line of her jaw with the restraint of a man who wanted more than he was allowing himself to take, and Ella felt the deliberateness of it. The way he was choosing to be slow when every line of tension in his body suggested he didn't want to be. Ella melted into the warmth before she could stop herself. She had missed him. In the chaotic, guilt-ridden way she had refused to acknowledge since the first time she had walked out of his apartment, telling herself it was the last time. She had missed the steadiness of him, the way he looked at her, directly, completely without the performance most people wore. The way every conversation with him felt like the most honest one she had had in years. Their foreheads rested together softly, and for a moment, just a moment, everything else disappeared. No Seoyin, no fear, no consequences, no city breathing outside the windows, no child growing quietly inside her that she didn't know how to protect yet. Just him and her and the warmth of shared breath and the knowledge that whatever happened next, something had already been decided between them that couldn't be undecided. Ella's eyes fluttered shut slowly as his gaze dropped to her lips. He was close enough that she could feel the restraint in him, feel the decision being made or not made in real time. Her fingers curled slightly into his jacket, and then, click, the apartment door opened. Ella's eyes snapped open immediately. Do-han turned sharply, and the air in the room died. Han, Seoyin, stood at the entrance. Bright red designer suit, elegant gold buttons glinting under the apartment lights, diamond earrings catching everything and throwing it back doubled. Perfect posture, perfect makeup, perfect, unimaginable heartbreak spreading across a face that had been composed for photographs and boardrooms, and a life designed entirely around one man. Her eyes moved from Ella to Do-han, to their joined hands, and something inside her shattered visibly. Nobody spoke. Nobody breathed. Ella slowly stepped back from Do-han. The distance felt enormous. Seo-yin laughed, but it was not a normal laugh. It was the kind that happens when pain arrives too suddenly for the body to process it properly, when the mind reaches for every available exit and finds them all sealed. You got her pregnant. Her voice cracked violently on the last word. What followed moved quickly and then very slowly, the way disasters always do, the gun appearing from Seo-yin's bag, Do-han stepping in front of Ella without a single moment of hesitation. The word yes landing in the room like a verdict. The way Seo-yin finally heard the thing she had perhaps always known, that she had never truly had him, and how that knowledge moved through her face in stages, like weather. When the gun finally lowered and Seo-yin walked out, closing the apartment door softly behind her, more softly than anything else that had happened, somehow, which made it worse. Ella stood in the silence Seo-yin had left behind and felt the whole weight of it settle. Do-han remained standing in front of her. Like even now, even after everything, his first instinct was still her. You need to leave Seoul. Ella stared at Kang Do-han like he had personally offended her ancestors. No. The response came immediately. Sharp. Absolute. She folded her arms across her chest with the practiced certainty of a woman who had been making her own decisions since she was 17 and had no intention of stopping now. Do-han exhaled slowly through his nose, already looking exhausted in the way that had nothing to do with sleep, the deeper exhaustion of a man who controlled cities and was currently being outmaneuvered by one stubborn woman in a too small apartment. Ella. No. Her voice was firm. You don't get to throw emotional damage into my life and then deport me. I'm not deporting you. You're literally asking me to disappear. I'm asking you to survive. That landed. Hard. She looked away first, which she hated. The apartment still carried traces of the night before in small ways. Her untouched tea sitting cold on the counter. One dining chair knocked slightly sideways, the particular quality of silence that follows a scene involving a loaded weapon in a living room. Ella stared at the cold tea for a moment before letting out a long, slow breath. Do-han moved closer carefully. He always moved carefully around her, she had noticed, like someone who understood the value of not startling things worth keeping. She won't stop, he said quietly. What happened here tonight, that was pain. The next thing will be strategy. Ella's jaw tightened immediately. I'm not scared of her. That's because you still think this is personal. She frowned. It's not, Do-han continued. This is power, reputation, her family name, business alliances that took decades to build. Pride. His gaze darkened in the particular way it did when he was speaking from knowledge she would rather not have. And Seo-yin has never handled humiliation well. A weak laugh escaped Ella before she could stop it. That woman pulled a gun on a pregnant person in designer heels. I think we've moved well past handling things well. A tiny flicker touched the corner of his mouth before disappearing. Even now, even in the middle of this, she could still make him almost smile. It was deeply inconvenient. You need to leave for a while, he repeated, his voice dropping softer. Just until I calm things down. Get ahead of her. And go where exactly? Anywhere you want. Ella blinked slowly. What? I'll arrange it. He said it the way he said everything. Quietly, with the absolute certainty of a man who had never once made a promise he didn't intend to keep. House. Security. Medical care. Anything you need. The offer sat between them. She understood what it meant. She understood what it cost him to say it, not financially, which was irrelevant, but in terms of admission, in terms of what he was claiming. And what? She asked emotionally. You'll just visit me between Mafia meetings? His expression tightened. You think this is funny? No. Her voice cracked softly. I think this is sad. Silence. Heavy. Breathing. Ella looked down at her hands. Hands that still felt like they should be shaking even though they weren't. I just found you, she whispered, and now you're asking me to leave. That one sentence nearly destroyed him. The vulnerability in it, The honesty, she so rarely let herself speak without covering it quickly in something wry. Because beneath all her stubbornness and sharp mouth and carefully maintained pride, beneath the girl who had moved to Seoul alone and built something out of nothing and refused to need anybody, she loved him. She had loved him for months and said nothing because loving Kang Do-han was the single most unreasonable decision she had ever made, and she had made it anyway. He stepped toward her slowly. Then gently, carefully, he pulled her into his arms. Ella melted immediately, like her body had been waiting all day for somewhere safe to put down the weight she had been carrying since the moment the pregnancy test rendered its quiet verdict this morning. She pressed her face against his chest and breathed him in and hated herself slightly for how much better it made everything feel. Do-han rested his chin lightly against her hair and closed his eyes briefly. Like this, just this, was the thing he had been working toward without knowing it. "You think I want you far from me," he murmured softly into her hair. Ella's fingers tightened against his shirt. "Then why are you doing this?" "Because I know exactly what people like Seo-yoon are capable of when they've been humiliated by someone they love." His voice stayed even, but she felt the tension in his jaw. "She has resources I don't want near you, near our child." The room fell quiet again. Ella hated how real the fear suddenly felt. Not dramatic fear, not the cinematic kind. Real fear. The kind that settles quietly in your stomach and slowly changes the temperature of your blood. "She's powerful too, isn't she?" Ella asked softly. Do-han didn't answer immediately, which was answer enough. Ella let out a slow breath. "Oh my God," she whispered against his chest. "I got pregnant in a Mafia love triangle." This time, he actually let out the faintest breath of genuine amusement, warm and low against her hair. She looked up immediately. "Did you just laugh?" "No, you did." "I didn't." "You absolutely did." And somehow, despite everything, despite the gun and the tears and the cold tea and the very real danger sitting quietly at the edges of their evening, they both smiled. Softly, sadly, like two people trying very hard to hold onto one small, warm thing while the world rearranged itself into something harder around them. Then Do-han's expression became serious again. His hands shifted to her face, tilting it gently upward. His gaze dropped briefly to her mouth and then came back up with the deliberate effort of a man making a choice. "You have to trust me." Ella looked at him for a long moment. The problem, of course, was that she did. Far too much, against far better judgment. "Okay," she said finally, very quietly. The word barely made it past her lips. But Do-han felt relief move through him instantly, warm and profound and more powerful than anything he had felt in a very long time. "You'll go?" Ella nodded weakly. "For the baby." His eyes softened immediately at that, something shifting in them that she hadn't seen before. Something new. "Our baby," he corrected quietly. Ella's heartbeat stumbled violently. She pressed her face back against his chest before he could see what that did to her expression. They stood like that for a long time. Neither of them spoke. The city moved outside the windows, Seoul, indifferent and enormous, continuing its business of being alive. And inside the apartment, nothing moved at all. She listened to his heartbeat, and he held her like something irreplaceable, and somewhere beneath the conversation and the fear and everything that was still undecided, something else was simply true, had been true for months, probably, that he was important. She had been right. She had just not known in what way. Finally, she pulled back, slightly, looked up at him with eyes that were dry now. The tears spent, the emotions wrung into something quieter and more useful. "Tell me it's going to be okay," she said. Not because she believed him automatically, not because she needed the reassurance of a lie, but because she needed to hear him say it the way he said things, with certainty, with commitment, with the weight of a man who understood that words, once spoken, became obligations. Do-han looked at her steadily. "It's going to be okay." She believed him. She hated how much she believed him. The next morning arrived too quickly, the way mornings always do when you are not ready for them. Ella stood beside her packed bags outside her apartment building, feeling numb in the strange, detached way people do when life starts moving faster than their emotions can manage. The bags looked too small for everything she was leaving. Or perhaps it was that everything she was leaving was too large to fit in bags at all. A black luxury SUV waited nearby. Two of Do-han's security detail stood respectfully beside it, careful not to look at either of them directly. The practiced invisibility of men trained to be present without being intrusive. The morning air was cold enough to sting the back of her throat. Seoul in early winter had a particular cruelty to it, beautiful and bright and absolutely merciless. Ella looked at her apartment building one more time. At the third-floor window where her life had assembled itself over 4 years, the mismatched curtain she had never gotten around to replacing, the windowsill where she kept a plant of truly astonishing resilience, the small light she always left on because she was afraid of coming home to darkness. "This feels illegal," she muttered softly. Do-han stood beside her in an all-black suit, one hand in his pocket, the other resting lightly against her lower back. Possessively, protectively, his eyes had barely left her since sunrise, tracking her movements with the focused intensity of a man cataloging everything against the possibility of its absence. "You'll call me every day," he said quietly. Ella looked up at him. "That sounds clingy." "I am clingy." She blinked slowly. The morning light fell across the side of his face and made him look almost ordinary for a second. Almost just a person. "Wow," she whispered. "Pregnancy really changed you fast." That tiny almost smile appeared. She loved that smile now. That was new information she didn't entirely know what to do with. One of the guards moved forward to place her luggage into the vehicle with quiet efficiency. Ella suddenly felt the weight of the moment arrive all at once, the way weight sometimes delays, following you at a distance before catching up. This was real. She was actually leaving. Leaving Seoul, leaving the apartment with the resilient plant and the mismatched curtains, leaving the city she had made her own, leaving him. Do-han noticed immediately. He always noticed. His hand slid gently to her cheek, unhurried, like they had all the time in the world, like a black van wasn't waiting, like his entire empire wasn't one wrong move from fracturing. "You'll come back," he said softly. Ella looked up at him with bright, uncooperative eyes. "Promise?" The question, so small, so genuine, so unlike every version of herself she usually presented to the world, nearly ruined him. "I promise." Their foreheads rested together. His hand stayed warm against her cheek. She could feel him breathing, could feel the restraint in him again. That same electric tension from the night before, the same proximity, the same gravity pulling toward something neither of them had quite yet reached. His gaze dropped slowly to her lips, lingered. Her breath caught. His head dipped lower. Screech. A black van tore around the corner violently. Do-han's head snapped up. His body changed in an instant, every softness gone, replaced by something cold and reactive and very, very dangerous. His guards reacted simultaneously, hands moving toward weapons. "Sir." The van doors burst open before it fully stopped. Everything happened too fast. Ella barely had time to gasp before a hand grabbed her arm with brutal force. "Do-han." He moved instantly. She saw it. Saw him move toward her with the terrifying speed of a man who had survived by being faster than everyone around him. But there were too many of them, and one of them had already grabbed her. And before she could process any of it, something slammed into the back of her neck with a force that turned the world liquid. Pain exploded through her. Her scream broke apart in her throat. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was Kang Do-han's face. Every composure he had ever worn stripped completely away, replaced by something raw and desperate and absolutely furious. "Ella." Then nothing. She woke to cold. Concrete floor, metal walls, the thin, gray light of warehouse fluorescence. Her neck throbbed violently and her hands were bound, and for several seconds she simply lay still, trying to assemble the world back from its scattered pieces. Then the fear arrived, not gradually, all at once. She sat up slowly, heart hammering. The guards surrounding the room were big, armed, and carefully not looking at her, the trained stillness of people who have learned not to see things they are paid to manage. Then the doors opened, bright red heels first, then the rest of Han Seo-yun, moving through a kidnapping scene like she was arriving at a board meeting. Perfectly composed, devastatingly elegant, the kind of beautiful that takes years of discipline and deep unhappiness to maintain. The guards lowered their heads, and Ella understood something in her chest, like a door opening onto a view she had hoped wasn't there. This wasn't just Do-han's world. Seo-yun belonged to it entirely. She had always belonged to it. The difference between them wasn't that one was dangerous and one wasn't. It was that one had always known it. Seo-yun stopped directly in front of her. Her eyes moved over Ella's face slowly, taking inventory, looking for something. Then she smiled, not warmly, the kind of smile that arrives at the end of something rather than the beginning. "I warned you." Ella's voice trembled despite herself. "I'm sorry." Seo-yun's expression shifted. Something moved through it that was almost human. "You're sorry," she repeated softly, testing the words. "I didn't plan any of this," Ella said honestly. "I didn't come to Seoul looking for this. I didn't look for him. I didn't want to be in the middle of anything." Seo-yun laughed softly, coldly, like laughter had become the only safe container for everything she was feeling. "But you still took him." "No." Ella shook her head immediately. "I didn't take him from you. He came to me." The room went silent. That hit something. She watched it land in Seo-yun's face. Not with cruelty, but with the blunt force of a truth that had perhaps been circling for a long time. "You think I don't know that?" Seo-yun whispered. Her jaw tightened. Her composure cracked. "You think I didn't see it? Since the night he met you, everything changed. He stopped listening to me. He stopped looking at me." Her voice fractured. "He stopped reaching for me in the dark." Ella's chest tightened painfully. She had not expected to feel sorry for Han Seo-yun. She had not expected to look at this woman in her perfect suit with her perfect heartbreak and feel grief on her behalf. But grief was not logical. Love, even love that had been given to someone who couldn't return it, was not logical. "Seo-yun, don't say my name." The scream echoed through the warehouse, raw and unmuffled. Even the guards flinched. Then Seo-yun reached into her bag. The blade caught the light when it appeared. Beautiful, polished, the kind of object that makes the world feel very small and very specific. Ella's blood ran cold. "If you disappear," Seo-yun whispered emotionally, "everything goes back to how it was." "You know that's not true," Ella said. The words came out quietly, honestly, without strategy or calculation, just truth. "You know even if I were gone, he wouldn't." The warehouse doors burst open. "Seo-yun!" Do-han's voice arrived like something weather-shaped. And then he was inside, moving through the space with absolute authority, the kind of presence that reorganizes rooms simply by entering them. Every guard stepped back. Not from the guards he had brought with him. From him. Seo-yun's face changed the moment she saw him. Everything hard in it cracked open into something unbearable. "You came," she whispered. Do-han's gaze moved instantly to Ella, checking, searching, cataloging, making sure she was real and breathing and whole. It took less than 3 seconds and contained more feeling than most people express in a year. "Do-han." The relief in Ella's voice was total. Seo-yun heard it, saw the way his shoulders dropped a fraction when he found her alive. Understood, finally and completely, what she had always feared she was seeing. "You love her," she whispered. The warehouse held its breath. Do-han stepped closer slowly. "Seo-yun, put it down. Answer me first." "I don't love her." He paused. "I love Ella." Silence exploded through the room. Ella stopped breathing. The words landed in her chest like something she had been waiting for and was completely unprepared to receive. Seo-yoon froze completely, like her soul had finally found the crack it had been building toward for years. Then something in her snapped. She rushed forward. Ella screamed, and then the sound came. Wet, brief, final. Seo-yoon stopped. The knife was buried in Do-han's stomach. He had stepped between them. Of course he had. Ella was on the floor with him before she knew she had moved, catching him, pressing her hands against the wound with no real knowledge of what she was doing, only that she could not stop doing it. Blood spread dark and fast across his black shirt. No, 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 please. His hand lifted weakly, found her face. Even now. It's okay, he whispered. No, it's not. She was sobbing, she realized. Shaking. The sound of her own voice frightened her. Behind them, Seo-yoon stared at the blood on her hands with the expression of a woman who had finally arrived somewhere she had not meant to go. Then, from outside, police sirens, distant at first, then not. Do-han let out the faintest, weakest breath of amusement. Took them long enough, he murmured through the pain. Ella stared at him through tears. You called the police? His eyes found hers, dark and steady and exhausted and more honest than she had ever seen them. I knew she'd take you, he said quietly. I planned ahead. Even now, even bleeding, even at the ragged edge of consciousness, she burst into harder tears. You absolute idiot, she whispered. I know. She pressed her forehead against his briefly, both hands still keeping pressure against the wound, blood soaking into her clothes, her skin, becoming part of the texture of the worst and most important night of her life. Stay awake, she told him. You don't get to leave. You promised. His eyes stayed on her. Then, quietly, beneath the screaming sirens and the chaos of officers flooding the building, beneath the sound of Seo-yoon being taken away and guards surrendering and a world finally arriving at its consequences, Kang Do-han said, I don't want my son growing up hearing his father was the most feared man in Seoul. The words shattered the room into something that couldn't be reassembled into what it had been before. Because for the first time, with blood on his hands and his choices and the floor beneath him, Kang Do-han was choosing something over power, over reputation, over survival. He was choosing to be someone's father. Someone's. Hers. Ella pressed her lips against his temple and held on. Outside, a city full of people who had feared him continued their lives, unaware. Inside, the most dangerous man in Seoul lay on a warehouse floor being held together by a woman he had tried to protect and failed and loved anyway. And the ambulance came, and the handcuffs came with it, which she thought was deeply unfair and said so, and one of the officers looked at her with the expression of a person who did not know how to respond to that. They wheeled him out. His eyes never left her. Not until the doors closed. Not until the last possible second. 3 months later, Kang Do-han survived. Barely. By margins that made the surgeons quiet and careful with their words when they spoke to Ella afterward. She had sat in a hospital corridor for 6 hours not knowing. A particular species of not knowing that is unlike anything else in human experience. That strips away everything non-essential until all that remains is the wanting. She had wanted him to live with a desperation that surprised her. She had not known she was capable of wanting something that much. He had lived. The news exploded across Seoul in waves. Money laundering, organized crime, corruption, a careful architecture of illegal dealings that had taken 15 years to build and approximately 72 hours to dismantle once investigators had the thread to pull. The most feared man in Seoul had fallen, and unlike every other man who had fallen before him, he did not fight it. Han Seo-yoon received prison time for kidnapping and attempted murder. Her family's carefully maintained public image collapsed with extraordinary speed, the way things do when the weight they're carrying has always been more than they admitted. And Kang Do-han accepted his sentence quietly. No escaping, no violence, no empire rebuilding from the inside. He sat across from his lawyers and told them clearly and without embellishment what he was willing to do and what he wasn't, and what he wanted his life to look like on the other side of this. and they stared at him like he was a man they had never met before. Perhaps he wasn't. 1 year later, the prison visitation room was quiet, cold, painted the institutional beige of rooms that have given up on being anything in particular. Kang Do-han sat at the table waiting. Same composed posture he had always carried, back straight, hands quiet, the stillness of a man who had learned to be patient with time. But prison had changed him. Anyone who had known him before would have seen it immediately. Something softer in the line of his jaw, something less armored about the way he occupied space. He had spent a year thinking instead of doing, and thinking had gotten into him the way water gets into stone, slowly and then everywhere. The door opened. He looked up and froze. Ella walked in slowly. She was more beautiful than he remembered, which was unreasonable given that he had spent 12 months thinking about her with very little else to occupy him. She wore her hair differently. Her eyes were tired in the way that had nothing to do with sleep deprivation and everything to do with the sustained, relentless, magnificent exhaustion of keeping a small human alive. She wasn't alone. A tiny boy held onto her hand. Dark curls, enormous dark eyes, tiny white sneakers that squeaked softly against the floor with every step. The sound of those small shoes on the floor reached Do-han's chest before anything else did. He stopped breathing. Ella smiled through eyes that were already bright. "Say hi to Daddy." The little boy looked up at the large, still man behind the table. Curious, unafraid, the easy, total fearlessness of someone who had never yet learned to be anything else. And for the first time in Kang Do-han's life, a life built on composure, on control, on the careful management of what he allowed other people to see, tears filled his eyes. Real tears. He covered his mouth briefly with one hand, like the emotion was physically trying to leave through his face, and he didn't know if he should stop it. Ella nearly broke apart seeing it. The most feared man in Seoul, unmade entirely by a child in squeaky shoes. She walked toward him slowly, lifting the little boy and carrying him the last few feet, settling him carefully into Do-han's arms. His hands, those large, steady hands that had held so many things with such careful control, wrapped around his son like something breakable and holy, like redemption in a small body. He looked up at Ella. The tears on his face were ones he no longer seemed interested in hiding. "I missed you," he said. His voice was rough with it. Ella smiled softly, leaned forward, placed her palm gently against his cheek, which was warm and real and hers. "We know," she said. The little boy reached up and touched his father's face with one small hand. Curious, gentle, completely certain of his welcome. And Do-han broke again, cleanly, fully in the best possible way. Ella leaned closer still. His eyes found hers with the same directness they always had, only quieter now, carrying something different. Not power, not strategy, not the controlled calculation of a man managing his world. Love, just love, the kind that had nothing left to hide. She kissed him softly, warm, patient, certain. The kiss of a woman who had waited, who had been afraid, who had cried in a warehouse while pressing her hands against a wound and bargained quietly with the universe, and who was still here, still choosing this, still choosing him, because some decisions once made cannot be unmade regardless of how unreasonable they are. He kissed her back with equal softness. His free hand rose to her face, careful the way it had always been, like touching something precious. Their son sat between them, momentarily fascinated by the collar of Do-han's uniform. When they parted, Do-han pressed his forehead against hers. Breathe. In the quiet of that prison room, with its institutional walls and its fluorescent light and the distant sound of a facility continuing to exist around them, Kang Do-han finally understood something he had spent his entire life unable to reach. Fear could build empires. Power could control cities. He had held both and found that neither of them, not one squared centimeter of either, had ever made him feel the way this moment did. Love was the only thing strong enough to save a man like him. He had needed to lose everything to find that out. He found holding his son and looking at the woman who had walked into a prison visitation room and still chosen to be there.